Buenos días, good morning, everyone. My name is Ricardo Perez, and I am Associate Professor of Anthropology and Coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Eastern Connecticut State University. I want to welcome everyone to our presentation this morning. I'm really glad to see faculty, students, and friends from the community here. Our event today, the new normal towards normalization of United States-Cuba relationships, will be more than a formal presentation. We want to have it as a conversation. So I would like that students and faculty and people from the community feel free to ask questions, both or either in Spanish and English. So this is gonna be somewhat like a bilingual sort of presentation. Our event today will be led by Ariel Dacal Diaz. He is a popular educator from the Martin Luther King Memorial Center in Havana, Cuba. And he will be aided by Angelica Salas. She will be the translator. She is a native of New Mexico, and she currently works at the center in Havana, Cuba, and obviously lives there. We also have with us this morning Ms. Susan Letendra. She is the director of Witness for Peace New England, and she would like to make a quick remark before Ariel and Angelica begin their presentation. I just want to finish my quick remarks with obviously saying that we're really happy and thrilled to have Ariel, Angelica, and Susan this morning. And I would like to acknowledge the support from various university units like the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work, of which I am a member, the School of the Arts and Sciences, the Dean's Office, as well as the Division of Student Affairs and the Intercultural Center. I know that some students here are attending the event as part of their presentations. I'm assuming there should be like a sign-up sheet for those purposes. I do have my own that I'm gonna put on the table at the back of the room, so please sign up the sheet so we are, as faculty, aware of your presence here today. And again, I would like that you guys feel, free to ask questions because we would like to have this more engaging and interactive event today rather than just a simple lecture. I think Susan wants to say a few words.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I just wanted to tell you a bit about Witness for Peace. Are any of you aware of the work of Witness for Peace? Yay. We've been around since the 80s, when a group of US citizens concerned about what our government was supporting in Central America went to Nicaragua to witness the Contra Wars against a democratically elected government, and came back to this country to organize, set up a permanent presence in Nicaragua, sent 5,000 people down to Nicaragua over the next few years. And since then, we've been doing solidarity work in Latin America where the need is greatest and we feel we can have the most impact. So now we have a permanent presence in Cuba, right here, in Colombia, in Honduras, and in Mexico, and we take economic justice delegations to Nicaragua as well. So we do delegations, we take people down to meet with civil society, and we also bring speakers to this area, and the regions, like Witness for Peace New England, is the organizing entity in this area. So we do a lot of action alerts, a lot of educational programming, etc. So, couple of norms for the meeting. We can't do a whole popular education series today because we don't have the time, but we're opening up a popular education space where every voice has value, every person has dignity and respect, and every question is honored. So with that in mind, when we take questions, we're going to take a group of them, about 5 at a time, and Ariel can develop a narrative and deliver that. And then if we have time, we'll take 5 more. If you feel comfortable speaking in Spanish and want to do that, please ask your question in English first so it invites everybody into the space, and then in Spanish. That would be helpful. Have I forgotten anything? No? Thank you. Turn it over to Ariel.
Buenos días a todas y a todos.
Good morning to all of you.
Es un placer estar acá esta mañana fría con ustedes.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Cold, but it's a pleasure to be with all of you.
El placer es estar con ustedes, no la mañana fría.
The pleasure is to be with all of you, not the cold morning.
Un dato es que esta temperatura es impensable en Cuba.
One fact is this temperature is unthinkable in Cuba.
Pero estoy seguro que el calor humano va a ser superior.
But I'm sure the warmth of humanity is here. So,
Bueno, mi nombre es Ariel, ya me presentaban. Vengo de Cuba
my name is Ariel, and I come from Cuba.
y vengo no a dar una conferencia, sino a conversar.
And I didn't come here to give a conference or a lecture, but more so to have a conversation.
Y vengo no a contarle la verdad sobre Cuba,
And I didn't come here to tell you the truth about Cuba,
sino mi verdad sobre Cuba.
but rather my truth about Cuba.
La Cuba que siento, la Cuba que vivo.
The Cuba that I feel, the Cuba that I live every day.
Muchos cubanos pueden pasar por esta mesa y contar su historia.
And many Cubans can come to this table and tell their story of Cuba.
Habrá visiones parecidas y otras visiones diferentes.
There will be some stories, some visions that are the same and others that will be different.
Por tanto, yo le voy a contar mi visión.
Therefore, I'm going to tell you my vision, or my version, excuse me.
Pero mi historia, mi manera de ver la historia, tiene que ver con el compromiso con el pueblo cubano.
But the way my story is, and what I'm going to speak of, is my commitment to the Cuban people.
Y el pueblo cubano está viviendo hoy un capítulo difícil de su historia.
And the Cuban people today are living a difficult chapter,
Un capítulo difícil de su historia.
and a difficult chapter in this history.
Un capítulo de cambios profundos
A chapter of profound changes,
y uno de esos cambios es la relación con los Estados Unidos.
and one of these changes, these profound changes, is our relationship with the United States.
A mí me gusta decir, la historia de Estados Unidos se puede contar sin hablar de Cuba, pero la historia de Cuba no se puede contar sin hablar de los Estados Unidos.
I would like to start that you can talk about the history of the United States, but you cannot, without mentioning Cuba, but you cannot talk about the history of Cuba without mentioning the United States.
Por tanto, es muy importante para la gente en Cuba el futuro de las relaciones con los Estados Unidos.
Therefore, it's very important, ¿cómo que?
Es muy importante para el futuro de las relaciones con
And
los Estados Unidos.
therefore, it's very important the future of the relationship between the United States and Cuba.
Y cuando hablamos de relaciones con los Estados Unidos, debemos hacer una separación.
And when we talk about the relationship between the United States, we're going to talk about it in two separations.
¿Sí? La relación del pueblo cubano con el pueblo norteamericano
The relationship with the Cuban people and the people from the United States,
y la relación del gobierno cubano con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
and the relationship between the Cuban government and the U.S. government,
Y hay muchas diferencias,
and there's much differences.
porque en la historia de los últimos 50 años,
Because in the history of the last 50 years,
el problema ha estado entre los gobiernos, no entre los pueblos.
the problem has actually been between the governments and not between the peoples of these two countries.
Por tanto, lo que se está negociando hoy es la relación entre los gobiernos.
Therefore, what's being negotiated today is actually between the two governments,
Que, por supuesto, va a ayudar a la relación entre los pueblos.
which of course is going to help and better the relationships between the two peoples.
Cuando yo hablo de estos temas, me gusta usar una imagen.
When I talk about this particular issue, I like to use a image.
Es la imagen de un barrio
It's an image of a neighborhood
donde viven muchas personas.
a neighborhood where there lives many people.
Y hay personas que quieren tener buenas relaciones con sus vecinos,
And there are people in this neighborhood who want to have good relations amongst their neighbors.
y hay otras personas que quieren imponer sus criterios al resto de los vecinos.
And there are other neighbors who want to impose their criticism or their way amongst the other neighbors.
Vecinos que quieren dominar todo el vecindario, a todo el barrio.
And then there's these neighbors who want to dominate the rest of the neighborhood and the neighbors around them.
Pero en los barrios hay vecinos pequeños que no quieren someterse.
And then there's smaller neighbors or neighbors that don't want to submit to this domination.
Y eso hace muy difícil la relación entre los vecinos.
And this makes the relationship very difficult between the neighbors.
Esa puede ser la historia de Cuba y los Estados Unidos.
And this can be the story, this is the history between the United States and Cuba.
Durante mucho tiempo, el vecino grande del barrio, el vecino poderoso del barrio,
Over many years, the larger neighbor, el vecino grande,
vivió dentro de la casa del vecino pequeño.
over many years has lived in the house of the smaller neighbor. And it dropped the microphone of the smaller neighbor.
Y las relaciones durante ese tiempo no fueron buenas.
And during this period of time, the relationship between these neighbors wasn't well.
Porque el vecino pequeño no podía poner el orden en la casa en el cual creía.
Because the smaller neighbor wasn't able to put the order of the house, the order in which they wanted their own house, in their own way, in their own form.
Y en un momento de la historia decidió sacar al vecino grande.
And at some point in history, they decided to take out the larger neighbor from their house
E intentar tener otro tipo de relaciones.
and intended to have other types of relations in their house.
Pero el vecino grande estuvo muy bravo, muy molesto.
But this bigger neighbor was really upset, very bothered by this,
Y castigó al vecino pequeño durante 55 años.
and punished the smaller neighbor over 55 years.
Esa también es parte de la historia entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos.
And this too is part of the history between the United States and Cuba.
55 años después, el vecino grande regresa
And 55 years later, this larger neighbor returned,
intenta tener otras relaciones con el vecino pequeño,
with the intentions to have different relations with the small neighbor.
y aquí aparece una pregunta fundamental.
And here it seems like we have a fundamental question.
El vecino grande entendió que el vecino pequeño tiene derecho a vivir y a ordenar su casa como quiera.
Repite, por favor.
El vecino grande entendió que el vecino pequeño tiene derecho a vivir como él desee.
Does the larger neighbor intend or understand that the smaller neighbor has its own rights, its own right?
Y va a establecer unas relaciones en relación a ese respeto.
And are they going to reestablish relations with this in mind?
O el vecino grande quiere acercarse para volver a entrar a la casa, pero ahora con otros métodos.
Or is this larger neighbor intending to take the smaller neighbor out? Para sacar
Para entrar otra vez a la casa.
but also to enter the house with the same intentions. Gracias.
Responder esa pregunta es responder cuál será el futuro de las relaciones.
To respond to this question is to respond to what is the future of this relationship.
La historia de Cuba tiene dos grandes basamentos.
The history of Cuba has two large basamentos,
Bases.
bases, foundations.
La independencia nacional
The national independence
y la justicia social.
and social justice.
No es posible tener un país independiente si al interior no es un país justo.
You cannot have an independent country when inside the country there's no justice.
Y no puedes tener un país justo si no tienes un país independiente.
And you can't have a country that's just if it doesn't have its independence.
Por tanto, la independencia y la justicia social son dos caras de la misma moneda.
Therefore, national independence and social justice are the same face. Yes. What's the expression? Two faces of a coin. Yes. Thank you.
Y Cuba ha intentado durante estos más de 50 años
And Cuba has tried for now more than 50 years
tener independencia nacional
to have national independence
y tener un orden en la casa que sea un orden justo.
and to have an order within their own home that is just.
Y ha entendido, y Cuba ha entendido de una manera profunda los derechos humanos.
And it has tried to have profound human rights.
El primer derecho humano, el más importante derecho humano,
The most important human right
es el derecho a la vida.
is the right to live.
Si usted no tiene derecho a vivir, ¿qué otro derecho va a ser prioridad?
If you don't have the right to live, what other right has priority?
Cuba tiene hoy una de las expectativas de vida más altas del mundo.
Today, Cuba has one of the highest levels of life expectancy,
Con niveles de el llamado primer mundo.
with levels that meet the most developed developed countries in the world.
De los llamados países del primer mundo.
What they call the most developed countries in the world.
Porque es un término cuestionable.
First world countries, what they call first world countries are.
Y para eso ha desarrollado un sistema social
And for this, we have developed a social system
que tiene dos bases fuertes.
that have two strong bases,
El sistema de educación y el sistema de salud.
the system of education and the system of health,
Gratis y universal.
free and universal.
Desde que naces hasta que mueres, tienes acceso a un sistema de salud que garantiza tu vida.
And from birth to death, you have a system of health that is guaranteed to you.
Y tienes derecho a un sistema de educación gratis desde de los primeros momentos hasta la universidad.
Yeah. And you have a system of education that is guaranteed to you free from the moment that you start your academic journey until university studies.
Que garantizan el derecho humano a una vida digna
That guarantees a dignified life
desde el conocimiento.
of knowledge. ¿No?
Desde el
From
conocimiento.
a place of knowledge.
Y parece que ese ha sido el principal delito que ha cometido Cuba.
And this is the delito.
Delito, crimen. Crime.
And this is the first crime that Cuba has committed.
Es por eso que hemos sido castigados,
And for this reason, we have been punished.
por intentar demostrar que se puede hacer de una manera diferente.
Because we have intended to do something different in a different way.
Pero en Cuba entendimos hace muchos años
But in Cuba, we've intended over many years, understood for many years, sorry,
que no es posible la justicia social
We have understood for many years that it's not possible to have social justice
si los derechos son una mercancía.
if rights have been market valued, if human rights have commercialized.
La salud, la educación, la vivienda
Health, education, housing
es un derecho,
is a right,
no un negocio.
not a business.
Porque si es un negocio, acceden a ellos solo lo que quienes los pueden pagar.
Because if it's a business, then
Si es un negocio, solo puede llegar a él las personas que lo pagan.
it's only available for those that can pay for it.
Dentro de las nuevas medidas que ha tomado el gobierno en este momento,
With the new measures that the government has taken at this time,
en la cual están introduciendo en Cuba relaciones también capitalistas de producción,
in which the Cuban government has also introduced capitalist relations
para la producción,
for production,
el gobierno ha dicho que no va a privatizar ni la educación ni la salud.
the government has announced that it would not privatize education, nor would it privatize health.
Pero Cuba está en una encrucijada, en un camino difícil.
But Cuba is in a difficult path right now. It's in a difficult path.
Cuba es un país pobre,
Cuba is a poor country,
es un país que no tiene suficientes recursos
a country that doesn't have sufficient resources,
y sustentar ese derecho a la vida de las personas necesita dinero,
and to sustain this, it needs
dinero.
it needs funds to continue these programs.
¿Qué hacer?
What can we do?
Muchas personas nos aconsejan lo que es eficiente en otras partes del mundo.
And many people have advised or given advice in terms of what is efficient in other parts of the world. Efficient, no?
Muy bien. Y Cuba quiere mantener un modelo de justicia social.
And Cuba wants to maintain a model of social justice.
Pero el modelo de justicia social tiene otras obligaciones también.
But the model of social justice has other obligations as well.
Durante mucho tiempo,
Over much time,
un grupo de personas en Cuba
a group within Cuba
le daba al pueblo lo que el pueblo necesitaba.
has given the people what the people have needed.
Pero dentro del modelo de justicia también es necesario que el pueblo se autogobierne.
But within this model of social justice, it's also important that the people have self-determination.
Y ese es un desafío que también tiene Cuba hoy.
And this is also a challenge that Cuba has today.
Cómo descubrimos otras maneras para que el pueblo se autogobierne.
How do we discover new ways in which the Cuban people have self-determination?
Desde mi punto de vista, la única manera de detener
From my point of view, the only way that we can have this,
las cosas no muy buenas que vienen de las relaciones con los Estados Unidos,
the things that aren't so good that come with the relations with the United States,
es el control popular.
is the popular control,
Es la democracia en todos los espacios.
is the democracy in all spaces, in all public spaces,
Sobre todo la democracia económica.
and also sobre and about and above all economic democracy.
Y es un gran desafío.
And that's a challenge. That's a big challenge.
Queremos crear un mundo diferente
We want to create a different world
dentro de un mundo que funciona de una manera.
inside a world that functions in a certain way.
Por tanto, el proyecto de soberanía nacional y de justicia social
Therefore, the project of national sovereignty and social justice
tiene desafíos muy grandes,
has great challenges,
de los cuales podemos hablar más en profundo a partir de sus preguntas.
and some of which we can talk about with some of your questions.
Por tanto, pueden hacer todas las preguntas que quieran,
Therefore, you can say all of the questions that you may have. It's open.
no solo preguntas, también comentarios.
Not only questions, but also comments.
También me gustaría saber cuáles las ideas que tienen sobre Cuba
And I'd also like to know what your ideas are about Cuba.
y estoy en la mejor disposición de compartirles mis visiones, mis opiniones.
And we're in the best position now to, for me to share my version.
¿Ok?
Okay? Thank you.
Muy bien.
Thank you all so much for being patient with me as well. I'm going to ask that if you also speak slowly and clearly in English, Ariel can understand quite well. And that would also help me too in terms of translating.
Mira por allá.
Ella va a preguntarla. Susan?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. Sorry.
Thank you very much for your very informative talk. As I listened to you, you answered one of the questions I had in mind, which was, if your neighbor comes into your house or into your home and comes with the same old attitude to want to dominate your home, you're saying that we should have popular democracy in all of the spaces, and that can help us, help you to counteract the domination, which is a good idea, I think. But I'm also thinking about your other forms of preparation. How is it are you preparing for the onslaught of U.S. Capitol? Is there something that you can do? Is there something that you might tell us about what the revolution has done to bring you to this stage where you can actually open up to deal effectively with U.S. Capitol? Thank you.
I have a question that piggybacks on Dr. Canterbury's question, and I will ask it in English, but then I will ask it slowly in Portuguese as well, because that is the language that I speak. Picking up on the notion of a neighborhood, the United States may be the biggest neighbor, but of course Cuba has many other neighbors. And so I would like you to comment on how relationships with these other neighbors, particularly in Latin America, may have prepared Cuba, or may be preparing Cuba, for what may come when U.S. Capitol invades the island. Eu acho que você entendeu bem, não? E não preciso, então, perguntar de novo em português. Obrigada.
Gracias.
Obrigada.
There was a question over here.
Hi, Ariel. Thank you for the interesting introduction for this debate. I'll pose the same question in Spanish. Ariel, my question is related to the notion of democracy. You mentioned the word democracy, you talk about economic democracy. One thing is the idea of democracy as government's ambition, the rules of a country. But I'm more curious you said, I'm going to come and talk about my Cuba. What is your notion of democracy? How somebody like Ariel exercises your democratic rights? Is this view different from other forms of democracy? Si quieres, Ariel, te la repito un poco en español. O si...
No, perfecto. Puede ser en español mejor. No, en español
en
también.
español, me interesa un poco más la experiencia tuya en la noción de democracia, ¿no? Porque cuando tú decías, vengo acá y hablo mi Cuba, mi experiencia, se habla mucho del proceso de democratización cubana interna del Partido Comunista, etcétera, pero me interesa más un poco cuál es para ti esa noción de democracia como ciudadano cubano, ¿no? Los espacios que tienes para ejercer tus derechos de ciudadano, los espacios que tus vecinos tienen, el proceso político. ¿Cómo ves la democracia desde los ojos de un cubano, de un ciudadano cubano?
Ok, hermano. Gracias.
Sport is big in Cuba, athletics. It's almost political. I'm just curious, how's Roberto Duran doing? And how is my favorite athlete down there, Hakeem Cruz, who used to run the 400 meters and 800 meters?
One more?
Wait, hold on a second. I'm sorry.
Es el deporte rentado, ¿no?
Yeah, in general, you want to understand specific people or in general the politics of sports in Cuba? Okay.
Ok. Gracias.
Y está diciendo alguna persona, pero...
Que vienen, sí. Ok.
I'm not up to date with the latest sports.
I was just curious about your personal background more, what perspective you're coming from, since we're hearing your perspective. Thank you.
Ok. Wow. Mira, por aquí. O vamos a esperar la otra vuelta. Ya.
Mi pregunta va dirigida a alguien que sea un primer visitante a Cuba.
If you want to repeat it in English, yeah, okay, entiendo. ¿Otra vez?
What are the steps should take a first visitor to Cuba and say, I am interested in visiting Cuba next year?
Talk to me.
And I want to make sure that, what are the steps that I should take to make sure that I go see the stuff that I want to see, that I'm going to be able to communicate my thoughts out of Cuba. And I'm interested very much in seeing nature in Cuba. This is the only island in the Caribbean that hasn't been covered by Hilton cement. And I want to see that. I'm also a percussionist, so I'm very much interested in music. And on the side, maybe a George Hernandez type of wish of cigars and rum.
Ok. Bueno, gracias por la jodita del medio. Gracias por las preguntas.
Thank you for the questions.
No me gusta hablar mucho al principio
I don't like to talk a lot in the beginning
porque la parte más importante es cuando me cuentan qué quieren saber sobre Cuba.
because for me the part most important is for you to tell me what you want to know about Cuba.
Y ahí puedo ampliar más.
And that way we can amplify or open up more.
Las relaciones con los Estados Unidos es bien difícil.
The relationship between the United States and Cuba is very difficult.
Anoche, cuando hablaba de este tema, usaba la imagen de una presa, un lugar donde se retiene el agua.
Yeah. Last night when we were discussing it, we used the image of a levee or a dam. Yeah?
Y yo recordaba una imagen triste,
And I remembered a really sad image.
lo que pasó con New Orleans cuando las paredes no pudieron contener el agua.
What happened with New Orleans when the levees weren't able to hold back the water?
La pregunta es, ¿cuán fuertes están las paredes de Cuba para resistir la presión del agua que viene del capital norteamericano? ¿Están fuertes las paredes en Cuba para...?
Yeah, and how strong, the question is, how strong are the levees or the dams in Cuba to restrain the flood from the United States, withstand from the United States?
Y por eso muchas son las paredes que hay que levantar.
And for this reason,
Son muchas las paredes, tenemos que levantar muchas paredes.
we have to put up many walls. Sorry, my brain is...
Hay un dato bueno, hay un dato que es un buen dato.
There's a good piece of information, a good fact.
Cuba se ha preparado para relacionarse con la economía mundial hace mucho tiempo.
Cuba has been prepared for a long time with the rest of the economic world.
Cuba tiene una ley para la inversión extranjera.
Cuba has a law in which is focused on foreign investment.
Y esa ley establece los límites para la relación con el capital
This law
extranjero.
establishes the limits of foreign capital investment in Cuba.
Cuba aprendió algo muy importante de la historia.
And Cuba's learned something really important in the history.
No podemos tener relación comercial con un solo país.
That we can't have trade relations with just one country.
En 1959,
In 1959,
Cuba tenía el 80% de su economía vinculada a los Estados Unidos.
In 1959, Cuba had 80% of its market dominated by the United States economy.
Estados Unidos se molestó porque queríamos ser independientes y nos cortó todo.
And the United States was very upset because that's when we cut off and wanted to become independent.
En 1989,
In 1989,
el 85% de nuestra economía estaba atada, estaba amarrada a la Unión Soviética.
and in 1989, Cuba, 85% was
Conectada
connected to the Soviet Union
economy.
economy.
Desapareció la Unión Soviética
The Soviet Union disappeared,
y otra vez tuvimos que empezar de cero.
and again, we had to start again in developing.
Yo creo que esa lección la hemos aprendido.
And
Creo que aprendimos esa
I
experiencia.
think we have to learn from this experience.
Y una de las políticas del gobierno hoy
And one of the policies of the government today
es que ningún país tenga más del 30% de nuestro intercambio comercial.
is that not one country has more than 30% of the foreign investment.
Pero la realidad es más compleja que los papeles.
But the reality is much more complex
Y quiero recordar,
than the document or the
que Cuba todavía es un país bloqueado por los Estados Unidos.
And we have to remember that Cuba is still a country that's blockaded by the United States.
Hay negociaciones, hay embajadas, pero hay bloqueo también todavía.
There's negotiations, there's embassies, but there's still a blockade.
Hay castigo todavía.
There's punishment still.
Y lógicamente somos muchos vecinos en el barrio.
And logically, there's many neighbors in this neighborhood.
Hubo un periodo de la historia en que Estados Unidos impidió la relación de Cuba con el resto de los vecinos.
And there was a period of time in which the United States, los Estados Unidos,
Sí.
impeded the relationships that Cuba had with other neighbors.
Pero poco a poco los vecinos empezaron a no estar de acuerdo con eso.
And little by little, the neighbors decided that they weren't in agreement with this, style of
Y el año pasado le dijeron a Estados Unidos que si el vecino Cuba no venía a la reunión del barrio, no iba a haber reunión en el barrio.
Yeah. And last year, there was a meeting, and the rest of the neighbors said if Cuba wasn't there at the neighborhood meeting, then they wouldn't be there either.
Y Cuba llegó a la reunión del barrio otra vez.
And Cuba returned to the neighborhood meeting once again.
Pero en las casas de esos vecinos,
But in the house of these neighbors,
también algunos están intentando hacer las cosas diferentes.
but in the house of these neighbors, they also are trying to do something differently.
Algunos de ellos están tratando de hacer las cosas diferentes.
Some of them are trying to do different things within their own home.
Y es muy bueno para Cuba porque también puede aprender de otros cómo hacerlo diferente.
Yeah, and this is really good for Cuba because we're able to learn different ways that they're doing and learn from them as well.
Y también tenemos intercambios comerciales que no son tan tensos,
And we also have trade relations with other countries that aren't so tense.
basados en complementar nuestras economías, en ayudarnos más que en competir.
And in some of these relations, they complement each other, they work together instead of compete with one another.
Voy a dejar la pregunta de la democracia para el final.
I'm going to wait for the question about democracy until the end.
Respecto al deporte,
In respect to sports,
Cuba, un país pobre y pequeño,
Cuba is a poor and small country,
decidió quitarle el deporte decidió que el deporte no fuera una mercancía.
but decided that sports was not going to be commercialized or it's not a commodity. That's the word I'm looking for.
Y gracias a eso, un pequeño país pobre
And thanks to this, the small country that's poor
llegó a tener el 5º lugar en una Olimpiada,
has been able to win the 5th place in the Olympics
1992.
in 1992.
Yo recuerdo que para las Olimpiadas del 92
I remember in the Olympics of 1992,
ya estábamos entrando en la crisis económica fuerte
we were entering a very strong economic crisis.
y los luchadores, los que competían en la lucha, no tenían equipos para entrenar.
And and the wrestling team didn't have the equipment that they needed.
¿Y saben qué usaban como pesa para hacer pesas?
And do you know what they used to lift weights?
A sus propios compañeros.
Their own buddies.
Lo cargaban y hacían
They
ejercicio.
lifted them and they did their exercise.
Y así se convirtieron en campeones olímpicos.
And this is how we, ¿cómo?
Y así
This is how we compete in these Olympics. Yeah.
y se convirtieron en campeones olímpicos. No es la única manera
This is not the only way
de ser un campeón olímpico.
to become a Olympic competitor, Olympic champion.
Por suerte ya hoy nuestros campeones tienen mejores instrumentos.
Yeah, and for we're lucky today that our Olympic champions have better equipment to train. Yeah.
Pero lo interesante es que el deporte es un derecho, también un derecho humano.
Yeah. But what's interesting, what's important is that sport is a right. It's a human right.
Pero en la nueva circunstancia que estamos viviendo,
But in the new circumstances in which we're living in,
la idea del deporte como mercancía también está tomando fuerza.
but sport as a commodity is, is also
Incrementando.
is coming about.
Hoy en Cuba hay más de 100 jugadores de béisbol
Today there are more than 100 baseball players
que están en la lógica del el deporte rentado.
that's in the logic of sports major leagues.
Es un problema.
That's a problem.
Habría que ver qué solución tendría en el futuro.
And we have to see what solution we can have in the future about that.
Y ha sido un problema todo el tiempo.
And this is a problem all the time.
Un
¿Por qué?
problema todo el tiempo.
Todo el tiempo ha sido un problema el tema de los deportistas.
And this has always been a problem, the problem of sports players leaving.
Cuba tiene un sistema de deporte masivo
Cuba has a massive sports system.
Sistema, ¿no?
sistema de deporte masivo, desde que son niños hasta que son campeones.
From when they're small children until they're champions.
Pero cuando esos campeones van de visita a otros lugares,
But when these champions go on visits to other countries,
se le acercan muy buenas personas a ofrecerle muy buenos contratos.
and they become close with very good people who give them really good contracts.
Y muchas personas quieren los buenos contratos
And many people want these good contracts,
y se nos van los deportistas.
and they leave as they leave.
Buenos deportistas que se han creado con el esfuerzo del pueblo.
And these are good athletes that have been trained. ¿Qué?
Que se han formado, que se han
But
creado con
that-
el esfuerzo
that
del
are
pueblo.
created by the strength of their people.
Así que es un tema también complicado que estamos viviendo ahora.
This is a issue that is complicated that we're living today.
A una persona que va por primera vez a Cuba, yo le daría un solo consejo.
And somebody who's going to Cuba for the very first time, I give you one piece of advice.
Permitan que Cuba los asombre.
Permit that Cuba ¿Cómo?
No, no, que le dé sorpresas.
Let Cuba surprise you.
Una sorpresa, a ver, sorprenderse es
To surprise you is
entrar a una realidad que es distinta a muchas realidades.
that you encounter a reality that's distinct of many realities,
Para bien o para mal.
for the good or for the bad.
Porque sobre Cuba hay dos historias
Because in Cuba there are two histories,
y ninguna es cierta.
and neither one is true.
Cuba no es un paraíso,
Cuba is not a paradise,
pero Cuba tampoco es un infierno.
but Cuba neither is hell.
Entonces, la invitación es a que descubran a un país que ni es un paraíso ni es un infierno.
So the invitation is that you discover a country that's neither a paradise nor hell.
Respecto a la democracia,
In respect to democracy,
yo trabajo en un centro, se llama el Centro Memorial Martin Luther King,
I work in a center called the Memorial Martin Luther King Center.
Nosotros trabajamos en procesos de educación para la participación.
And we work in the process or in workshops for the formation of education, la formación de educación, ¿no?
En educación popular, pero para la participación social.
But education for participation.
La participación tiene tres condiciones.
Participation has three conditions:
Que las personas quieran participar,
that the persons want to participate,
que las personas quieran participar,
that the people want to participate,
que las personas puedan participar
that the people can participate,
y que las personas sepan participar.
and that the people know how to participate.
En una cultura que nos han educado en que alguien decide por nosotros, decía que
I was saying that
uno de los elementos de la participación es que la gente aprenda a participar.
one of the elements of participation is that people should learn to participate.
Venimos de una cultura en que nos enseñaron que alguien decide por nosotros.
We come from a culture that we learned that somebody else decides for us.
Y la idea principal
And the principal idea
es que podamos decidir sobre nuestras vidas,
is that we can decide over our lives,
pero no reducido a una decisión individual,
but not simply reduced to an individual idea,
sino a una decisión individual que comparte con una decisión colectiva.
but just about an individual decision that shares a collective idea.
Por tanto,
Therefore,
la participación depende de mi reconocimiento como individuo,
participation depends on my recognition of myself as an individual,
pero que ese individuo solo pueda ser pleno, amplio en una colectividad.
but that individual can be, manifest fully in that collectivity.
Y esa es la base para cualquier interpretación democrática.
And that's the basis for any interpretation of democratic participation.
La democracia tiene que ir desde la cama hasta el Estado.
Democracy has to go from the cradle to the state.
La democracia también es cómo yo le permito a mi hijo que tenga opinión, que tenga criterio, que lo defienda.
Democracy is also how I let my child to have individual criterion that he can participate.
Tanto como yo lo puedo reclamar del Estado.
As much as I can reclaim that participation from the state.
Tiene que ver la democracia con la manera en que me relaciono con mi compañera.
Democracy has to be about the relationship I have with my partner,
Pero tiene que ver con la manera en que yo organizo mi vida laboral.
and it has to do also with the way I organize my working life,
Mi vida comunitaria.
my community life.
La democracia tiene que ser sentido común.
Democracy has to be common sense,
Y ese sentido común tiene dos condiciones.
and that common sense has two conditions.
El primero es reconocer el derecho de la otra persona.
First is to acknowledge the other person's rights,
Y el segundo es que no lo puedo hacer solo.
and the second is that I cannot do it by myself.
También tiene que tener en cuenta una noción del poder.
It also has to have in mind a power notion, a notion of power.
No es solo usar el poder que me falta,
It's not just to use the power that I'm lacking,
sino dejar el que me sobra también.
but also
Dejar fuera el que me sobra.
give away what it's lacking or what I don't have.
Porque el poder no es solo reclamar los espacios que me faltan,
Because power is not just to reclaim the spaces that I'm lacking or that I need,
sino darle a otros los espacios que yo le quito.
but to give somebody else the spaces that I'm taking away from him or her.
Y yo creo que la sociedad se puede organizar de esa manera.
I believe that society can be organized around those ideas.
Y un último elemento de mi comprensión sobre la democracia
And one last element about my interpretation of democracy
es que tiene que cambiar la comprensión sobre la libertad, la idea que hay sobre la libertad.
is that it has to change the idea about liberty.
La libertad puede ser una pelea de libertades,
Liberty can be a fight between liberties or freedoms.
Mi libertad termina donde empieza la tuya.
My liberty ends when yours starts.
Otra idea que lo cambia es,
Another idea that changes that is,
yo soy libre si tú también eres libre.
I am free if you are free.
Mi libertad es condición de tu libertad
My liberty is condition of your liberty.
y tiene que ver con un individuo que es libre,
And it has to do with an individual or a person who is free.
que es libre para crear,
Who is free to create,
pero que es libre también para producir las relaciones sociales,
but is also free to produce social relations
porque somos animalitos sociales
because we are social beings.
y nos han educado en que somos individualidades desconectadas unas de otras.
And we have been educated to understand that we are individuals disconnected from one another.
Y desde esas percepciones parte mi noción de la democracia.
And from these perceptions starts my notion of democracy.
¿Es esa una idea central en Cuba hoy?
Is that a central idea in Cuba today?
No,
No,
ni en ninguna otra parte del mundo.
nor anywhere else.
Por tanto, ver la democracia de esa manera no es solo un problema para Cuba,
Therefore, to see democracy in that way is not just a Cuban problem.
es un problema para el barrio.
It's a problem for the neighborhood.
Okay.
Okay.